So this talk is called Olmec Origins, the Mystery of Mexico's Megalith Builders. And today we're going to be looking into the pre-Mayan world of ancient Central America. My name's Hugh Newman. I'm an ancient mysteries author and researcher, and I've been exploring Mexico and Central America since 2003, having spent a total of about 9 months there. Looking into the Olmec, the Maya, the Toltec and other ancient cultures of that part of the world. So some of the things we're going to look at today is looking at the earliest evidence in ancient Mexico, specifically focusing on the mysterious origins of the Olmec, who were the pre-Mayan civilization, really the mother culture of that area. We'll look at the way they may have influenced the Maya with the famous Mayan calendars, the long count calendar and the Tzolk'in and others. We'll look at artifacts and we'll question as to where they really came from. There's connections with Africa, China, Polynesia and other places around the world. We'll also note that they were interested in deforming their skulls. They were also shamanic culture, taking 5-MeO-DMT for instance, and also we find evidence of giants in this part of the world. So the area we're looking at is the Gulf Coast of Mexico, specifically around this area here, the Olmec Heartland. The main area up here is the Mayan civilization. Over here we have Teotihuacan around Mexico City, but here is the Olmec area, which spread this way and this way, as we will see a little bit later. If we zoom in a little bit, we'll see a town called Coatzacoalcos, which translates as Serpent Sanctuary. Very interestingly, the Tonala River and the Coatzacoalcos River, they kind of join up here, form what look like a sinuous serpent through the landscape. And it's actually on these islands within this river that many of the Olmec sites were actually built. Now, if you don't know who the Olmec are, they were flourishing around 1800 BC onwards in Central America, in this area. And they're famous for the 17 Olmec heads that were discovered. These are colossal size heads. Some of them are up to 8 or 9 feet tall, some weigh up to 40 tons. And they clearly show non-Central American features, which some people say are African, others say are Polynesian. But as we'll see with the other statues that we'll look at through the lecture, there's even Oriental influences as well. This is another head that was discovered in Guatemala, and it was reported in the early 1900s, and it's since been destroyed. So no one knows where this is or where it came from, but no doubt you've seen this image before. And people get confused, they think it's Olmec, but they really don't know. So this area here is the most interesting. The first Olmec head, the first colossal head, was discovered in 1862, which became known as the site of Tres Zapotes. They believed it was just another Mayan kind of feature, another Mayan sculpture, but it really wasn't. In 1905, more research was done by German archaeologist Edward Seller. And strangely, the Aztec name Olmec is a translation of rubber people, because they were producing rubber from the trees in that part of the world. And it's really the Aztec who talked about this ancient culture going way, way back to the time of the gods and the giants, and even before that. So the first head was found near Tres Zapotes, 1862, and Jose Melgar, who was the discoverer, he wrote, he said, "What astonished me was the Ethiopic type represented. I reflected that there had undoubtedly been Negroes in this country, and this has been the first epoch of the world." This is a quote from exactly what he said. Franz Blum and Oliver Lafarge in 1925 discovered this area, and including Levente, which is one of the main Olmec sites. 1927, Herman Bayer was struck by this, the African features of this particular culture, and he believed it was a Totonac civilization. That was the name he was given by some of the locals. George C. Valiant continued using the name Olmec after it was first introduced in the 1920s, and it's kind of stuck since. And here are just some of the other explorers who were involved in discovering the Olmec people. Tres Zapotes, this is a very interesting site. Now, it's one of the later Olmec sites, but we're putting it first because it was the first one that was really discovered, going back, nearly 100 years now. And Firstly, the first head was discovered in the 1800s, but it really got discovered in the early 1900s. And it was Matthew Stirling who was interested in this culture even as early as 1932, but it wasn't until the 1940s that he started excavating there. And this is where it really took off. And one of the first things he discovered was not only this, one of the colossal Olmec heads, but this particular stone called Stela C. And the reason this was interesting, this is Matthew Stirling here, who's a Smithsonian archaeologist. The reason this was interesting because it showed long count calendar dates, which they thought was a Mayan invention. And the long count was the calendar that began in 3114 BC and ended on December the 21st, 2012. So the fact that they were finding these dates here, and this one here, the date they kind of worked out when they found the second part of the stone was from roughly about 31 or 32 BC. This just shows you the back end of the stone, and it shows you this sort of figure here. You also got this face on the stone here, and this is the front of the stone, which shows you the dot and bar system which created this Ahawa date, which they believe goes back to September the 3rd, 32 BC, which at the time was the earliest calendar date they'd come across. And this was before the time of the Maya. There was some controversy about this, and his wife actually found the second part of the stele, and this confirmed the date when it was discovered in 1969. And also we find other kind of writing here as well, sort of strange script that was found here, also at Tres Zapotes, which people believed was one of the earliest forms of language in Central America. There's also a site called Chiapa de Corzo, which was discovered in 1939, and another date going back to a similar era, 36 BC, was uncovered on this particular stele. So again, we're finding extremely early dating on these particular stones, suggesting it was most certainly before the Maya. And you can imagine what it was like back in the late 30s and 1940s. The fact is, they had to trek through jungle, they had to hire local people who didn't speak the language, they got threatened with their life many times, there was no roads, they had to travel by river and through jungle on donkeys and things like this. And it's a tropical climate, so it's raining a lot, it's muddy, and it's incredibly difficult to navigate. And they believe Tres Zapotes dates to around 1000 BC up until around 500 BC when it changed power. Before that was San Lorenzo and Levente, which we'll look at in a moment. Here's just a photo of the group, the archaeologists there in late 1939. This is what the site looks like now. You can go and visit this. You don't get to actually go to the site, but you get to see some of the amazing artifacts that are on display in the museum. This is a huge piece of basalt, and strangely, this is acoustic. It's almost like someone would stand in the middle of this and it would hit them together to create some kind of acoustic or musical effect. This is one of the great Olmec colossal heads, the first one that was discovered. And this is a map or a plan of the site. And you can actually go there now, and we do go there. This is an aerial view of it. And you can see it's really just what's left of earth and mounds. It's been excavated, it's been looted. There was stonework there, as you saw in the museum. There were these colossal heads. Some of the pyramids had stone coverings and so forth. And we got a chance to go there a few years ago, and this is us climbing one of the pyramids. And this is us at the top, checking it all out. And this is one of the more elongated pyramids that we find on the site, now occupied by some cows. Here's another one. So it's interesting to get to these sites to get a sense of the energy, and also it's worth looking around because when we were there we actually made discoveries of this handle of some ceramic pot, similar to what we saw in the local museum. Other Olmec heads, this was found nearby, a place called Le Capota. This is the largest Olmec head. This is up to about 40 tons, and it was the last one ever made, apparently, and it's just a few hundred years BC. It's on display at Santiago Tuxtla, the local town to Tres Zapotes. And in the museum in Santiago Tuxtla, we have these very interesting stone carvings. And this is quite long. This is like 6 or 7 feet long. And that would be slipped into the base of the pyramid, either side of the steps leading up to the main platform. And you can see clearly these are not local people's features. These were clearly stated in the early writings of Matthew Stirling and others that they look very West African, especially with the type of hairstyle as well. This is a close-up of the Rancho Capanna head, the 40-ton one. It's the only one with the eyes closed as well. This is another one from Torres. You can see this beautiful features, beautiful carving, some of the most intricate carving. It's been compared to the quality of ancient Egypt. The interesting thing about this one, on the back of it, we have 7 braids coming down, which certain researchers, including Ivan van Sertima, believes are proof that this was from African origin. Again, this is the Le Cabota head, an illustration of it just to get a sense of the quality of the stonework. We have this kind of grimacing mouth, which is a feature we find on many of the Olmec sculptures. Just to prove how good they were at stonework, these are some 3D relief shells carved on a piece of andesite. Now this is an unusual, there's not much of this around in Mexico, so this is extremely hard rock, similar, very similar in constitution to what we find at Tiwanaku and Pumapunku in Peru, Bolivia area. Again, this just shows you a photo of the actual statue that was sort of placed within the base of the temple, the base of the pyramid. Another one here. Now this has been compared by Ivan van Sertima to what we find in Egypt at some of the temples here. This is actually in the Cairo Museum, and this is the one we find at Torres. Some of the features have been compared to a Nuba chief in Kenya and other such things here. We'll come on to that shortly, but it really was Ivan van Sertima who kind of opened this up. And even the Popol Vuh in the sacred book of the Quiché Maya claim that the Olmec came to Mexico in ships of bark. It means that black Africans sailed across the Atlantic Ocean long before Columbus. But when did this journey begin? When did this really happen? Something we'll look at a little bit later. And this was really put forward by the brilliant Ivan van Sertima, who lived until 2009. He was a Guyanese-born professor of Africana Studies at Rutgers University in the United States, and basically the authority of the African presence in the Americas. And I quote him, "A study of the Olmec civilization reveals elements that so closely parallel ritual traits and techniques in the Egypto-Nubian world of the same period that it is difficult to maintain that all these are due to mere coincidence." And I believe this is indeed the case. But if we look at some other sites around the area, especially San Lorenzo, we've got Tres Zapotes here, we've got San Lorenzo here. We'll have a look at this site now, because this is the oldest, probably the first site that was being used and utilized by the Olmecs. And again, incredibly difficult to get to, go through rivers and swamps, but they found this amazing colossal head. And many of these heads were deliberately buried, and it was really not until 1945 that it was properly started to be excavated. But you know, even while they were there, locals were taking many artifacts and valuables away. But look at the quality of the workmanship there. And these were all originally upright at specific places in the temple, often like protecting the temple as such. 15 major monuments are now on display at Jalapa Museum. And in 1964, Michael Coe, one of the main excavators there, got carbon dates. Some of the earliest dates went back to 1800 BC, but they mostly focused around 1200 BC. You can go and see the site now. A 10th head, there was 9 discovered there until 1994, when a 10th colossal head was found, this one here. And by a magnetometer survey, and it was the archaeologist Anne Cyphers who actually uncovered this at the site. Interesting thing about this, the headdress is formed of 92 circular beads that completely cover the upper part of the head. There's ear spools, it looks like an older gentleman because the sagging cheeks and lines under the eyes, but a very pronounced chin, which is quite different to some of the other Olmec colossal heads. And the interesting thing about these is that at the site itself, they found a cache of something like 40 or 50,000 of these magnetite beads, which look exactly like these, which, because they're magnetite, they have qualities which can affect your brain chemistry and your pineal gland. And it's thought now this is part of the reason they were working with this particular technology. We have interesting dates here. This is some of the earliest dates. They managed to go 2260 BC, plus or minus 100 years. So they're not sure what's going on here because officially they only got 1200 to 1800 BC. But I believe it is as old as that or even older. You can see some of the scoop marks on the rock here. It's one of the rocks at the San Lorenzo Museum. The site's just further down this road. You're not supposed to go there, but we do. And this is some of the stones that were unearthed at San Lorenzo. We've got this beautiful bird motif with the heads missing. We've got this sort of figure laying over the stone, beautiful relief carving. And we have these spheres that were carved, not dissimilar to other ones we find in other parts of Central America. We have this mutilated head, we have these strange features, probably for stands, and this black rock, which was a sacred rock, possibly at the centre of the San Lorenzo site. Then we have this very unhappy bearded figure, which is unusual for Olmec carvings, especially these type. But there are other figures we'll see at Levente and other sites which clearly show almost European or Semitic looking people with beards and facial hair. This is the actual site itself. There's not much left here. But the interesting thing about this is that it was built upon a natural basalt rock kind of plateau, which has been known and tested by John Burke to allow electric charge and energies to move through the site. There were 21 man-made lakes up on the plateau and 14 natural springs at the base. And the thing about San Lorenzo, as with Levente, they found that it was actually in the middle of the river. So the river would go by, and they built up this site on this natural kind of basalt outcrop and mound in the middle of the site. It was a huge site. There were a few other sites nearby as well, which we'll look at in a moment. So sluice gates controlled the fast water flow around these pyramid structures, and there was over 100 tons of basalt were used to create these particular things. In the museum there you can see piles of these stones, and so what they were doing, they were moving water and it would charge up, it would generate electric charge and magnetism and so forth, and you place your seeds there, your grains, and it would charge them up. You go and plant them. This was tested by John Burke. You actually get an increased yield of crop and larger crops as well. So this was quite remarkable because it's very similar to what we find at Tiwanaku and Pumapunku in Bolivia, the same technology. So there are suggestions there were connections between Central and South America. One of the most interesting aspects here is the fact that at San Lorenzo they found an iron ore magnet, possibly the earliest magnet in the world. And there's also very strong magnetic fluctuations at the site itself, like it was chosen deliberately because it was on top of a magnetic anomaly. And we know there are connections, as we'll see shortly, with the Chinese and the Olmec. And so we have to kind of take this quite seriously. I mean, it's only quite a small bar, it's only like this big, but it was part of a larger bar of magnetite. It had been polished, it had a groove running down the middle, and it was thought to be, you know, compared when you hang a needle on it, it was actually used like a proper compass. And one of the other interesting things about this is that the Chinese didn't even invent this type of magnet until hundreds of years later. So where did it really come from? Was it the Olmec? We also find that some other sites, this is just an example we're going to look at a little bit later, down in southern Guatemala, a place called La Democracia. It was originally from a site called Monte Alto. These are like Buddha Olmec figures. You know, these are my photos. I went there and you can just sit around them in the park there. But on the right-hand side of the temple here is where the magnetic strength is in the rock. And this is being found in the other Olmec heads as well, like the magnetic hotspot. Like it's part of, they understood how your brain got affected by magnets by wearing the magnet helmet. And they would actually mark it and hide that invisibly within the stone structures they were even building. It's quite remarkable. So this is San Lorenzo. This is actually the Monument 1, first one that was discovered. And it's now in Jalapa Museum, 1200 to 900 BC. This is Monument 2, Head 2, and I just wanted to try and do a comparison with my face to see how similar we look. But notice some of the features as we go through this. I'm not going to describe too much, but you can see the earpieces, you can see the way the head is flattened, and the kind of helmets they're wearing. They're all similar, but each of them has an individual face on them. They're all individuals. You have these feathers coming down the back. We have cut marks in this one here, which is unusual. Again, you can see the different features here. Again, this is in Jalapa Museum. This is when it was first discovered. Monument 5, again in the Jalapa Museum. Monument 6, Head 6. This is quite an intriguing one because it's got these features up on top here, which people have suggested could have some kind of meaning. This is actually now in Mexico Anthropology Museum in Mexico City. Head 7, this is at Jalapa Museum. It's very battered and worn. This is one of the better preserved one. This is head number 7. And you can just see the features here are quite remarkable, the way they've done this. It's got these strange feathers on the hat as well. And this one is in Jalapa Museum as well. Sort of slightly smiling, almost smiling. And this is the most recently discovered one in 1994. It's actually in San Lorenzo itself with these magnetite beads covering the whole head, including going below the ear. So it's almost like some kind of magnetic helmet. And there's all 17 of them on display at one of the museums in Santiago, Tuxtla. So you can see they're very large heads. So, and there are no bodies on these. Other statues had bodies, but not the heads themselves. They were just single heads marking certain territories of the temples. We have these crouching figures, which some people say is the Quizzo position, and sort of holding a kind of scroll in his hand. Heads in the background there. Very reminiscent of Egyptian features. We have other carvings here. We have many of these at most of the sites. We have these altars, or thrones they're called, and often these were actually made into Olmec heads. After they'd been used as thrones, they got turned into Olmec heads. It's very strange, but that's how these people operated. So you have the shaman or king emerging from the earth, holding a serpent or a scroll against the ground. Yeah, we've seen this one already. These are the ones from San Lorenzo, but it shows you that there's some on display at San Lorenzo and at the Jalapa Museum. There were some other areas around here, around this area here. This is the Tuxtla Mountains. This is where the stone came from, the basalt came from, that went to all these different sites. And remember, they had to move this stone, very large pieces, up to like 40 tons. Some were larger in other parts of the temples. Often at 60 miles, this is the furthest they would take them to, like San Andreas and Levente. Tres Zapotes is quite nearby. But in this area was found the Tuxtla statuette in the mountains in 1902. It's made of nephrite jade, and it was discovered by a farmer ploughing his field in the west foothills of the mountains. It has 75 glyphs of what's called Epi-Olmec, or Isthmian script, which is like the small thin spread of land through Mexico there between the two oceans. And it's one of the few examples that has this kind of script. It has a long count date on it, going to 162 AD. So we know, again, this was before the Maya. It's on display currently at the Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City. This is a place called San Andreas. This is like the sister site to Levente. And in December 2002, this was discovered. And it shows a calendar seal, which would be rolled with ink onto scrolls or some kind of paper, and it has a date, interestingly, which goes back to 650 BC, and this is based upon the long count, and there's a date on it relating to the Tzolk'in 260-day sacred calendar, which again was thought to be developed and invented by the Mayans. Also at San Andreas, early maize pollen was discovered, dating to 3100 BC. So we know that this area around Levente was in use, and there were people living here developing agriculture at that early date. And it's interesting, that date, because the beginning of the long count calendar starts in August 3114 BC, just 114 years different, or 14 years different, sorry, to where this was actually found. It also was noted that there may be written words on this, which is basically, it's like the first, possibly the first in the world, or certainly the first in Central America, the first writing, not only the first writing, but the first printing press as such, because they would roll it round. Similar to the Sumerians, so obviously a little bit earlier, but this was happening here in Central America. But really the most important, the most interesting site to me is Levente, You can still visit this site. You can still see this pyramid structure at the site. We even have wheeled figures, suggesting they may have invented the wheel. Very African features here. And this is the layout of the site. And it's very, very complicated. It's 8 degrees off north, going this direction. And basically, it's bizarre. There's stuff going on under the ground. It's built upon a magnetic and a gravitational anomaly. It's built within a river. There's rivers going either side of it, where they like an island in the middle is where Levente exists in the Tanala River. And this is one of the earliest, if not the earliest, pyramid known in Mesoamerica. It's 110 feet high, 1,000 cubic meters of earth fill, and it's got this strange kind of shape to it. It's not a classic pyramid, it's like 7-sided fluted cone. And it's never really been excavated, so it could be a major burial site of the ancient Olmec kings. And it looks a bit like some of the volcanic cones in the Tuxtla Mountains. That's what it's being compared to. But here's some of the altars. These are replicas, as all the stones and artifacts, statues have been moved to Villahermosa. But you can just see the quality of the stonework, and the layout is amazing. And it is simply an astonishing site. Again, if we go down to this end of the site, we can see that there used to be many of these basalt columns all upright in a kind of concentric circles. These 3 heads, replicas, used to face the other way, away from the site. They've got it wrong. They didn't face inwards, they faced away. They know that, but this looks better when the tourists visit. And these are some of the basalt columns which are brought from the Tuxtla Mountains. Massive stellars. No one knows. This is like 15, 20 feet tall. No one knows exactly what's going on here, but there's depictions of rain gods, Olmec figures, flying bearded figures, and so forth. And it goes this again shows you the water channels that were discovered at Levente, suggesting they were working not only with irrigating the land, but also with charged water for energetic purposes. This is monument 1 from Levente, and this just shows you one of the classic Olmec heads. And this was first described by Franz Blom and Oliver Lafarge, 1925. This is the sort of happy-looking one. I tried to imitate him when I was there a few years ago. This is now on display at the Carlos Pellicer Museum in Villahermosa. This is monument 3. It's almost 2 meters tall, or 6.5 feet high. And it was moved to Villahermosa like all the other heads from Levente. The radiocarbon dating of where it was discovered is around 1000 BC. It's got severe damage through weathering, but it's got the common expressions of the Olmec head. This one, monument 4, this was actually discovered by Matthew Stirling in 1939. And this is an absolutely intriguing one. This is the one that people have compared to the face of the Sphinx. This is an unfinished head. This is like one of the heads, and you can see the sort of stone tooling marks on here. Almost looks like they softened the stone. They didn't actually work the hard stone, but you never know. They may have had very intricate techniques and tooling. And even amazingly, we actually met a restaurant owner who looked like an Olmec when we were there a few years ago. So it looks like the descendants of the Olmec still exist in Central America. He was based near Levente. And these are some of the other pieces, massive stones. These are like 100, maybe 80 tons, 60 tons, something like this. This one is like nearly 20 feet tall. These could have been Olmec heads originally, but they've been recarved and they've got arms and legs on them. But these were only discovered a few years ago, and they could represent 2 more Olmec colossal heads. This is one of the classic pictures of Matthew Stirling looking absolutely awesome and powerful. Look at him with one of the statues found at Levente. An interesting story. Don Sebastian Torres, who was an 80-year-old Indian who protected and lived at Levente, he grew corn there, and he was there when Matthew Stirling arrived in 1940 to come and excavate the site. And he was told that ghosts of the Aztec emperor Montezuma would sing and dance in the ruins. No one ever saw that, but this was the story that was given to him. And this is a very interesting piece. These altars or thrones really get me, because these were made into Olmec heads later. And you've got this shaman figure. He's holding something down here. He's holding his foot there, but he's got this I thought was a serpent, but you have 4 serpents coming in here. You have other serpents up here as well. You have crosses, which are a representation of Quetzalcoatl, who we'll talk about later. But around the side here, we have a female figure, like a goddess figure, whose arm becomes a serpent and comes round the base here. So it's very shamanic, very psychedelic even, imagery carved into this massive block of basalt. And this is the actual stone. I had a very powerful experience here when I went here in 2009 with my good friend Ivan Orozco. And we went around the site at Levente Park rather, at Villa Hermosa, and we touched every stone. Wanted to get a sense of the energies and what these stones, you know, if there's something going on here. But when we reached this one, we had the strangest experience where we felt a force field of energy around this particular stone. You could walk in and out of it, and we both had it. We were both absolutely convinced there was some kind of energy field that had been activated or something. So that really blew my mind. It made me realise there's something really special going on with these Olmec shamans, whoever they were. This is one of the only female figures, a goddess figure. It's called the Goddess, on display at Levente Park. This was in a prominent position at the centre of Levente. Then we have this. This is one thing we find a lot of in the Olmec world, is this cleft skull. Now, this is something we also find in ancient Chinese traditions, in many of the old depictions. The interesting thing is there's actually skulls that are being found in this part of the world that are cranial deformed into this kind of shape. We have this gentleman here, he's called the Warrior, and he's coming at you with some kind of, looks like a mace. You have these flying figures around wearing strange helmets, jumping around. You've got other things going on around the edge here. Very intricate, beautiful relief carvings at Levente. Also, we have these tombs that were found buried just under the ground with the basalt columns. Inside them they had sarcophagi, stone sarcophagi within them. These were like the outer part of the tomb. And this is on display at the Mexico Anthropology Museum in Mexico City. This is another flying figure here. This gentleman here we'll look at in a moment. It's called Uncle Sam because he's got a beard and hooked nose. This guy here is just flying and pointing. So what the hell he's doing, we don't know. But we have this imagery. It's almost like shamanic imagery of like a flying shaman, sort of, you know, releasing himself from the earthly domain. And this is a zoom in of what we've got here. And this is very intriguing because it looks kind of Mayan, but it also has Semitic features with a fake beard on him as well. So we find these fake beards obviously in ancient Egypt. We have the famous Monument 19, I believe, at Levente. This is a huge serpent with plumes, like feathers, surrounding this figure with some kind of headgear on, with something like a breathing apparatus holding one of these so-called man bags, unless it's some kind of device. We have the crosses here, which represent Quetzalcoatl, and many other features going on here. Now, this is very, very unusual. And this could be the first or the earliest representation of the plumed serpent or Quetzalcoatl. And this was found at Levente. It's now on display at the Mexico National Museum of Anthropology. If we zoom in a bit, we can see this strangeness going on around his lips, like something's attached to him there. We have what looks like a helmet. It could be a fake beard. This is very intriguing. This is found all over the world. Jim features that in some of his lectures. But it's absolutely strange. I mean, obviously we find these so-called bags that people are carrying around the world in different sites. It's Göbekli Tepe, possibly, Sumeria, obviously the Olmec. But these are interesting because these come from northwest Africa. Now, these are the features that Ivan van Sertima, the facial features, he believed were linked with the Olmec. So the fact we're finding the same kind of imagery here as here is quite intriguing. We also have Egyptian connections, which something that J.J. Ainsworth pointed out when me and her went to, we've been to both these sites. This is the Temple of Isis in Egypt. This is the god Hapi, and he's encircled by a flying serpent, and he's holding things in his hand, very similar to what we find at Levente, almost identical, in fact. So this is very, very strange. So we're seeing what Ivan van Sertima said 40 years ago, that indeed there are direct connections between these two great ancient cultures. And this is more evidence of worldwide travel. We have this Sumerian or Phoenician looking gentleman called the Traveller or the Ambassador. It's monument number 13 at Levente. We have these unusual glyphs. No one's been able to decipher these. That one looks like a bird head, but it's got these strange upturned pointed shoes with a scythe or a flag, and this headdress, which is remarkably similar to images that have been seen in Carthage and Byblos in Lebanon and other places, suggesting a Canaanite or Phoenician connection between these great ancient cultures, which we'll look at more in a moment. We also have these underground weir jaguar faces. These are made of serpentine, which was imported from quite about 80 miles away. And there were many of these under the ground, buried under the ground. Over 1,000 tons of serpentine was found in one of the pits, multiple layers of it. There were also serpentine and jade mosaics laid out, as you can see in these images here. And this is very magnetic stone as well, and it was specifically chosen, I believe, for this purpose. Why you would lay all this down under the ground, then bury it in multiple layers, is unclear. And you can see how deep this goes down. We have layers of olive clay, mosaic, more clay, mirrors, Celt offerings, pink clay, adobe bricks, all this stuff going under the ground that was hidden. So whether it was for spiritual or esoteric or shamanic purposes, or whether it had an energetic effect, which I believe it did, then this is what was going on here. This just shows you a cross section from one of the early archaeological books. It shows you the colours they were working with as well. And this goes back about 25 feet deep, 60 feet wide, 1,000 tons of serpentine, hundreds of thousands of tons of different types of clay. There was basalt columns even buried in the ground as well as on top. Absolutely remarkable. And also under the ground we found things like this. We have this sort of figure, which is like a flying figure holding some kind of torch. But also these were buried, these serpentine figures, sorry, jade figures, well actually jade, granite and serpentine, there's various different ones, were found, all 16 of them, under the ground, deep buried within these layers we just looked at. And strangely, they date from about 1200 BC, but they did some analysis of the data. Someone dug down in around 800 BC to check they were all still there and in position, and then filled it back up and came back to the surface. So this is strange. They were checking that these figures were still buried in a certain part of the ground 400 years after they'd been originally buried there. The strange thing about these is that they have elongated skulls, clearly cranial deformation, and they have oriental features, which is one of the anomalies of Olmec land. And we have these ones here again. This is one of the close-up with all carvings all over the body as well. And we have this. We have like the crying baby. Look at the frowning skull, symbols of the cleft here. And again, we even have carvings on some of these uprights. These probably represent the basalt columns that are originally at one end of Levente. We also have the wrestler. This is from a place called Capanna, near, not too far from the area of Veracruz. But clearly the features here do not look local. He looks like he's dancing, or he's wrestling, or he's doing yoga. But he's got a beard as well, very intriguing. And he's got a sort of shaped skull as well, like some kind of sort of representation. But isn't that beautifully carved? Then we have these as well. These are very strange. They're frowning babies with no genitals. This is very similar of the traditions in the Shang dynasty of their admirals and ambassadors who were often eunuchs. I don't want to go into exactly what that was about, but they elongated their skulls as well, and you can see elongation in some of the skulls featured here. We have other examples here. Very, very intriguing. And there are connections between these different cultures. We have Olmec here, and both of these, this one here rather, is Shang dynasty, showing a mohawk haircut, and also in the Quizo position, much like this one here from Levente, almost identical in style. And then we have similar Quizo positions here. This was also worn by the Colombians, Africans and Mohawk Indians of the St. Lawrence River. And in China, the Shang dynasty China, it is associated with ancient magicians or sorcerers. So the fact you're finding that here and here is remarkable. Again, we have more of the cleft skulls here. We have spaceman type features here, very frowning figures, all from Olmec land. And on the left here we have Olmec symbols, which show the cleft skull with a pointy part on top, which they believe is some kind of crown or protuberance from the top. And these are from Shang Dynasty carvings as well, also on jade. Again, elongated skulls and sort of strange beard or tusks coming off this gentleman that was found at Levente. And there is evidence of cranial deformation, which you can see in some of the museums. And these are from the area of the Gulf Coast. We also have a giant skull here, which I made a video about, which you can check out on YouTube. And more elongated skulls from this area. So we know that the Olmec were probably doing this, even though most of the skulls and skeletons have been destroyed by the tropical and acidic climate. Just a comparison here. This is from one of the islands off the coast of Veracruz. This is from Nazca, and this is a strange turtle figure. I don't know why that's there, but one of the questions about who these Olmec were is like, what were they called? This is one of the strange things that there's only like really one reference that I've managed to find. It talks about what was the name of this culture, because we know the Olmec was an Aztec name given to this lost culture who lived on the Gulf Coast. But there was a translation in one of the old codices, and it was the land of the bird snake, which is like basically the land of the feathered serpent, the land of Quetzalcoatl. And the translation it came from was Tamoanchan. Tamoanchan, which is the very interesting name. So the fact is that the ancient name potentially given to the actual Olmecs were the Tamoanchanians or Tamoanchans. And this is from a codice that was discovered by Father Shogun. It was during the Spanish conquest. And this is what they believed they were called. And it was from a book, a codice called the Book of Days, or the Book of Dreams, or the Book of the Year. Whoever they were, they spread out from this area. They didn't just stay here, they spread this way, down south, towards Guatemala, Honduras, Costa Rica. They also went this way, towards the Juxtahualaca Cave, Chalcatzingo, and other places around Mexico City. But they came in, they began here at Coastal Caucasus, and they continued through this area. We'll get on to more about this place shortly. This is one of the sites in southern Guatemala called El Baúl. Beautiful headdresses, similar to the Olmec. It's a little bit later. And we have this very strange figure. We have these figures here holding up this guy's actually, that's actually a helmet, like a bear helmet. You can see the eye is separate underneath it, breathing fire with these strange symbols here. It's a bit inexplicable, most of this. Very dangerous area to go to, actually. There's a place called Abashtacalic, again, which is on just over the border between Mexico and Guatemala. And we have what looks like an Olmec head has been discovered there, as well as megalithic chambers and caves. And also strange figures that are carved, crouching, Quizzo features, Olmec type features as well. And there's pyramid structures at this particular site. These are from a site called Monte Alto, which is one of the most prominent megalithic temple sites here. And again, we have the serpents eating a human being, and eating themselves, which is pretty scary. But La Democracia, as we saw earlier, we have these kind of Buddha figures with the magnetic temples in their head. But then we have these figures. This is a massive head. It's a little bit later than the Olmecs, but from Monte Alto, on display at La Democracia now, with these what looks like sunglasses or goggle-eyed features. And I kept seeing these goggle-eyed features. I've seen them in other places around the world, specifically Tiwanaku and Pumapunku. We find them here, and on many other. We also have lots and lots of references to psilocybin mushrooms, which we know the ancient people in this area were taking. So I did some research on these goggle-eyed figures. I was trying to find out what this was. Then I found out that even on these old depictions, this is from the Temple of the Jaguar at Chichen Itza, which is the later Toltec/Mayan site, these figures here, which have a serpent going around them, which is this is a plumed serpent, a representation of Quetzalcoatl, have goggle eyes on them here and here as well, and on some of the others. So this kind of interested me, because these goggled-eyed priests, enveloped or surrounded by the Ku Klux Klan or Quetzalcoatl, and they're frequently shown when representing these godlike beings of the plumed serpent with goggle eyes, and they're linked with Itzama and Kukulkan, the ancient gods. There's also the rattlesnake, and I just find it fascinating that you're finding the same thing down at Tiwanaku in Bolivia. We're finding the goggle eyes on all these different statues here, suggesting a possible connection. We also find the bird figurine here with serpents on the sides. So we've got birds and serpents, and obviously 6 fingers, 6 toes on one of the feet. And again here, the goggle eyes, we're finding them at all the different statues around Tiwanaku, and even similar Olmec type mouths on some of them as well. We have the stone spheres of San Lorenzo. This was actually found at Capanna in Honduras, which is believed to have Olmec origins. These are the one of over 300 or 400 really that were found in Costa Rica. So we know that the influence and all these different techniques and styles were found in many different parts of the world, in the Americas. So we've been down that way. There's more down here, and I believe there's more connections to be made going in this direction. But one of the areas I've investigated is this area around here, especially Chalcatzingo, which is one of the most important sites, I believe, in the Americas. It dates actually to quite an early date. It goes back to around 1500 BC, possibly before. Discovered in 1932 in the central highlands of Mexico. This is one of the pyramids that's been reconstructed at the site. But there's also some very amazing carvings on the rocks up in the mountains there. This one's called El Rey Monument 2. This was photographed in 1978, possibly the best photograph I've seen on it since they put this horrible roof over the top of it. But you can see again a figure, seated figure, holding some things like looks like an Olmec baby, again surrounded by these almost like a snake-like clouds going around the edge. And there's another depiction of what it looks like. These are thought to be representing rain and clouds, or Tlaloc, the rain god of the ancient Olmec and Mayans. We have a flying figure here. It's difficult to see, but you can see the movement here. We have another flying figure here at Chalcatzingo. And this is really one of the outposts of the Olmecs. And it's thought this was an area where, not too far from here, where some of the jade came from for this particular culture. This is actually on display at the National Anthropology Museum in Mexico City. Dates to around 900 BC. But this was a very important site, and this proves that the Olmecs weren't just stuck around the Gulf Coast. And there's more discoveries as you head further south and around the area. There's a few sites we had a look at. This is actually from Chalcatzingo, and it shows you kind of Olmec type features. But even these features have been found at Teotihuacan around Mexico City. This is the Pyramid of the Moon, and a beautiful stone with carvings on it in the center, and also Olmec type features and some of the jade masks. Now Teotihuacan is a very intriguing site. It's definitely connected with Quetzalcoatl, and it sort of translates as where men became gods. This is like kind of, a site where it transforms you. This is the pyramid of the plumed serpent, which is one of the oldest parts of the site. But it's also got legends stating that a race of giants called the Quinametsin actually built Teotihuacan, and also other sites, other pyramid sites in the area. This could even be a representation of them. This is the Pyramid of Sun in the distance, viewed from the Pyramid of the Moon, as me just sort of chilling out after a large climb up. But this is a huge area that Teotihuacan takes up, and there's been tunnels discovered underneath it. There's some mica sheets which have been found inside the Pyramid of the Sun, which come from Brazil. There's new discoveries that are being made that link it to the Olmecs and make it much, much older. And I believe the Olmecs were involved, or certainly living in this area, but it may have even been originally constructed by the earlier giants, which we're going to get onto in a little while. Cholula is also a huge pyramid site. It's actually the largest pyramid in the world. And it was apparently, the story says, that it was built in honor of the peaceful god Quetzalcoatl. But it's so big that when the Spanish arrived, they didn't even realize how big it was. They thought it was a natural hill, and they built a church on top of it. Jade has been found in this area, so they think the Olmecs were certainly connected with it. It's 45 acres, the base of it. It's that large. It's a height of 210 feet. So it's 3 times the size of the Great Pyramid. And it's most certainly at least 2,000 years old. When Cortes turned up in 1519, Hernan Cortes, a Spanish conquistador, over 100,000 people lived in this area. And he actually slaughtered about 6,000 people within the first few days of him being there. But legend does state that men of gigantic and deformed stature built it, according to the ancient chronicles. Around the side of it, we have this courtyard. We have what looks like an Olmec head, a very rough-hewn one, maybe created and put there in honor of their earlier ancestors, with these stelae, strange carvings of serpents and so forth. And around the side here, we have a megalithic stone with a hole carved in it with a mortise and tenon type joint on top, which I believe could be older than the original construction. But in Aztec mythology, the Quinametsin populated the world during the previous era of the Sun of Rain, which is basically one of the suns. There's like 5 ancient suns, and this was one of the earlier ones. And it's thought that they stood over 10 feet tall and weighed about 650 pounds each. And we know that there are reference to this because we've done a lot of research in Mexico and found numerous accounts of 15-foot tall, 12-foot tall giants. And also this is from the Codex Vaticano A, which shows the death of a giant being destroyed by a bunch of local people. But it appeared much like the Nephilim of ancient, the ancient Bible, and also the giants that were created by Viracocha in South America. They were punished by the gods because they did not venerate them. And the peak civilization came to an end as a result of great calamities and this punishment from the heavens for grave sins they had committed, which is very, very close to the other accounts we've seen from the Bible lands and South America. And it's believed that they, indeed, the giants in prehistoric times, built Teotihuacan and Cholula. And so what's going on here? Were these actually the Olmec people? Because in some accounts, some versions of these old stories, they claimed that they were of a different race, they were a different type of human, and it could be representing the Olmec culture, who seemed to have emerged from nowhere 1800 BC. So even a Dominican friar, in the 1500s, talked about, and apparently, he talks about 7 of these giants that survived the flood, and they continued building. And one of them was called Zaluha. This Dominican friar talked about the country being inhabited by giants who all perished. But one of the giants, called Zaluha, who was surnamed the Architect, he went and built the site as a memorial to Tlaloc, the rain god. And then the people kind of turned against him because he forced them to build the pyramids, like slaves. And they hurled fire on the pyramid and everyone perished. The work was discontinued, and later the monument was dedicated to Quetzalcoatl. So there's very strange kind of myths and stories associated with these sites. And Quetzalcoatl really is at the core of this. So we're going to have a brief outline of who this plumed serpent deity was. And he really was interesting because, according to the early traditions, he arrived specifically, some say on a golden boat, some say on a raft of serpents. He came with followers. He was tall, he had long hair, a long beard, and he came on land and taught the arts of civilization. Like he taught mathematics, geometry, megalithic construction, pyramids, agriculture, numerology, the calendar, and other higher principles. And he was revered as he travelled through the land. And this is probably in prehistoric times, going many thousands of years BC. And he was known as Kukulkan or Quetzalcoatl, which pretty much translates as the plumed serpent. There are different languages which give him different names. And even the Aztecs were still revering him many thousands of years later. And even when the Spanish arrived, they believed Cortes and his people arriving on these boats, which they thought were a raft of serpents. They thought it was him returning because when he left, he only travelled around the country, apparently Quetzalcoatl, for about 20 or so years, then disappeared on his raft of serpents, promising to return in the year 1 reed. And strangely, the year 1 reed, which repeats every 50 or so years, is one of the years that Hernan Cortes arrived on his boat. So they thought it was the return of the bearded, fair-skinned gods on their raft of serpents, and that enabled Cortes to dominate and take over the entire land. There's much more to this than just this, but there are representations of a man here, a bearded man, emerging from a bird serpent head, which is on display at one of the sites in the area of Tabasco. And there's thoughts that he travelled through the land. He may have even gone down to South America and became Bochica in Colombia, Viracocha in ancient Peru and Bolivia. And sometimes he had his face painted black, which is really intriguing because this, they think, is the connection with the Olmecs. And one of the ideas is that he was connected with Venus, the morning star, and this has been related by many different accounts. And you can see that here, this representation here with the plumed serpent going around, a representation of Venus. But there are more carvings from Chichen Itza which show religious rituals with the winged cuckoo clan hovering over the sea, and you can see that here and here. And again, we see the connection with Egypt here. Now, this is really intriguing. So we've had a brief outline of the Olmec, a quick look at Quetzalcoatl. We have to question what's going on here. Where did these people really come from? Were they really Central Native American, or did they come from another place? I believe Ivan van Sertima was onto something here. We have the original connection, which it sounds like Quetzalcoatl may have arrived. It may have even been from Egypt. We find symbolism like this, the Atlanteans holding up the world in both Egypt, where we have the Nut, the sky goddess here, and the Atlantean dwarfs holding up the world in Olmec land, coming from all these different parts of the world, specifically Egypt and Africa. And we even have Thoth as well. And Zacharias Sitchin wrote, and who believed that Thoth may have arrived with a band of followers, i.e. the Africans from Western Africa, at around the time, but just before the first Pharaonic age, around 3100 BC. And his arrival instigated the beginning of the long count calendar, 3114 BC. And there are good, strong theories because we find bird-headed gods within the Olmec land, as well as the combination with the serpent. So we have the beginning of the long count calendar, 3114 BC, at the same time as the first pharaoh, Menes, or the Scorpion King, began in ancient Egypt, which is around 3110 BC. So it seems like the ancient gods fled or were pushed out of Egypt, and a new reign came in. So they arrived in Mexico and decided to begin their calendar on their arrival date. There's another theory which has come forth, that the Ramesses III, who was living around 1186 to 1155 BC, or he reigned at that time at least, from the 20th dynasty, he was considered to be the last monarch of the New Kingdom, and he had a high authority, and he was linked to a series of invasions and problems in the area. And apparently, it looks like he may have fled Egypt and disappeared to what was called the land of Punt and quarried the copper mines of somewhere called Timna and so forth. And so there's stories that there were different eras of the Egyptians making their way over to this particular area. This is an image carving from another site in the area, which is very, very interesting. And this shows you what looks like a representation of these different races of people coming in at different times. It's supposed to represent 12 different cycles of people arriving from Africa to Central America. There are other claims as well. In 1972, there was skeletal evidence from several Olmec sites that were the West African types. There's Dr. Wasinski in 1972. There were some sites around Mexico City, Olmec sites, which seem to be connected to Africa. There's also certain parts of the African language, and so on and so forth, all over Central and South America. And we have the classic winged serpent in ancient Egypt as well, as we do in Central America. So we're finding all these connections from all these different parts of the world, and it has actually been proven that travel could have been made going in both directions. We know, for instance, that the Egyptian mummies that were discovered had cocaine in their system and tobacco, which would have come from the Americas. So we know there are connections in all these different parts of the world. So I suggest that the Olmec was a cosmopolitan civilization. It was flourishing at a very early age, before 1800 BC. But from that time onwards, there were connections with the Chinese, there were connections with even the Middle East, there were connections with Egypt and other parts of the world. And this is why there's so many strange statues, carvings and bearded figures and other such things happening in Central America. And Quetzalcoatl may have been the key to this. He was the one that seemed to instigate high civilization in the Americas, with pyramid building and megalithic construction and the arts and sciences that spread through the world at that particular time. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope you got an insight into the lost world of the Olmecs.